Maybe we can start. So, Bruchim Habaim, we have more people registered, but it does happen sometimes, especially um, when there's no ask in the registration of any kind. It does happen sometimes that people just bail. So,
and they forget,
or they forget, or any number of other possibilities. So, um, let me tell you what I'm doing here. This is really largely, I'm just cycling back through the class that I taught on Shavuot. So if you were there for that whole class, there's going to be a lot of overlap for this, and consider yourself fairly warned. So I will not be offended if you decide that you need to jump off. So let me tell you what gave rise to this class. So in part, what gave rise to it was just different teachings that I had encountered that were on this very profound topic of what Yiddishkeit, what Torah teaches us about dealing with moments of crisis in our individual and collective lives. And I was just intrigued just on purely on the level of ideas, because I think that, as when you approach a text, you can approach the text with the text outside of you, so to speak, as we all know. Like, one can read a novel or a play by Shakespeare, and without finding connections to one's own life, you can just appreciate, the beauty of on the literary level. So to some extent, it was just my encountering different ideas that had a kind of resonant literary beauty to them, profundity that resonated with me. But then also, just as as I as all of us look out into the world right now, and we see within our culture profound crises. And I think that in moments of crisis, we have to ask ourselves whether we really have hope that there will be that we'll be able to move through the crisis in a good way. The crises around us are new, in the sense that it's not that there have not been crises before, but I believe that, and I'm speaking with regard to America at this moment. I'm not speaking with regard to the Jewish community, but certainly that's related, and we'll talk about that. But as a culture, I think that and I'm not saying anything innovative here, but as a culture, the West and the America and European West has been facing a kind of crisis of its own. A crisis in its own institutions, crisis of faith in its institutions, crisis of faith in some ways of its core fundamental ideas for some time. So one of the features of modernity, and post-modernity in particular. And by the way, if this kind of talk does not interest you, don't worry. We're going to jump into the Jewish texts in a moment. But one of the features of modernity, and especially of post-modernity, is examining the foundations of our culture's belief and and its history, and deconstructing those the values, the beliefs, and the history that have given rise to the culture. So if in early modernity, if the West in early modernity believed that it was kind of approaching the apex of its own history, this history that it traced back both to Judeo-Christian values, but also to the Greek tradition, was starting to create a society in which a lot of good was emerging, and the kind of fetters of of a um, of a superstitious past, and the some if somebody I'm totally digging that music that I'm hearing, but if somebody could turn on their mute button, I'm hearing some noise there in the background. But I'm always interested in music recommendations. So if whoever that was, let me know. But if the West believed that it was leaving superstition behind and leaving kind of political chaos behind and establishing a new order of reason and democracy, and a self-understanding, so if that was in early modernity, by the 20th century, it was pretty widespread that there were just real doubts about the Western project in some ways. That is, the ability of Western democracies to be beacons of justice and goodness and hope. So these are not new ideas at all, these doubts about our own culture. But I do think that one of the things that's been so breathtaking for us in the 21st century is now we're actually really living right in the face of some of these crises rather than just sort of reflecting upon them. So whether one stands on the political left or the political right at this moment, to see, I don't think it's too much to say that there's a lot of perception that democracy is in crisis, and there's questions about the institutions of our government um, to fulfill their promises of having being led by principles of law and fairness and equity. Questions about the motivations of the political parties and even the validity of the core institutions and the Constitution itself. Questions of racial justice. So all of these things that we see as like part of the daily news cycle are I think profound crises that get to the question about whether a person can have hope in the future. And to make this sort of a little bit less theoretical, for those who have children and grandchildren, I can't be the only person who's wondered for a brief moment, what kind of world have I brought my children into? When I grew up in Portland, Oregon in the 70s, there's just a sense of, I don't know, I guess sort of an assumption that things were moving at least to my young, naive self, that things were moving in a good direction. And that even with American political crisis of the 1970s, that it seemed like there was the core of the country and the core of its values were still together, and that we would get through these political difficulties and economic difficulties, and the American project would bring goodness ultimately. And I don't think that anybody can just sort of um, I think fewer people now can just sort of say, yeah, of course that's the case than they might have a couple of decades ago, a few decades ago. Part of it are new global realities like global warming, and then all the other stuff I don't have to tell you about that we read about in the newspaper. And so when I say crisis, that's the other part of the motivation for this class, was the crises that I perceive that we're a part of. And I think I conceived of this class before the killing of George Floyd, and but I think that the questions of whether America is a place that can deliver justice to all of its citizens is just yet another part of this. So that's the second part. So again, I'm just going over the reasons for this class and what's behind it. The first was just my appreciation of some of the beauty of these texts as literary documents. The other is a real felt sense in the world that we are living in a moment of cultural crisis that preceded us by many decades, but is part of our lives. And then I guess the third thing that I would say separately, and then I promise I'll shut up and we'll dive into the text. The third thing that I would say is a separate point, but it's related to the second point I just made, is a sort of for the revealed traditions, that is, and I'm speaking now as a Jew, a real crisis of faith because of the just because of what we've learned about history and what we've learned about other religious traditions. I think it's become more and more difficult for more and more people, or I'll just say for more and more Jews, to say with confidence, yes, the Torah is clearly from God, and yes, Judaism is the answer to how to live one's life in a full way and in a righteous way. I don't want to belabor that too much because I'm not saying anything particularly revealing. I'm certainly by far not I'm not the worst person to say this, so I don't want to belabor it, but there's a crisis that religious traditions have been in for, well over a century now, and even more than that, of trying to grapple with what we have learned about the world, what we've learned about science, what we've learned about history. And so the question of how does one live in a world where all of the kind of foundations are falling apart, or they sometimes seem to be falling apart, how do we live in that? And that is what made me explore this topic. And what I will make one promise about this class. You will not walk away with answers as to how do you happily skip through moments of cultural and personal crisis. I do not have the answer, but I want to share with you texts and thinking that acknowledge what it is to face crisis and possibilities for discovering hope. So I want to sort of, I feel like I'm leading a tour to some of these texts, and this is not a polemic that is trying to convince you that there's nothing to be worried about and everything is fine. That's not the purpose of this class. Having said all of that and trying to convey to you that this is not just abstract, but really a product of me looking into the world and struggling with the question of great difficulty. Is there any order in the world that will justify my desire to have hope in it? With that as the background, and that is really the reason for the class, I will now dive in. And we'll pause along the way so people can question and delve and share their own thoughts about stuff. But right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump you right into the middle of some of the texts that I used. And I will also just put my cards on the table. I'm approaching this as I'm approaching this as a Kabbalist. The reason I'm hesitating for that is because I don't think I know enough to really call myself a Kabbalist, but I'm very taken with Kabbalistic readings of the universe, and so that's going to come through a lot of the stuff that you're seeing. So Hasidic texts, mystical texts are going to be a deep part of what we're looking at. All right, so with all of that behind us as a very long introduction. Okay, are you seeing text in front of you? All right.
Rabbi, it's very small.
Oh, really?
It's
okay,
really tiny.
Okay, hold on.
Thank you.
I'll make it bigger. So this is a little confusing because, hold on, now I'm trying to make you bigger on my screen. One second. Are you seeing a text in front of you is not necessarily a useful question aimed at a group of studious Jews who have set aside time on a Thursday night, because whether it's mine or something else, you probably have a text in front of you. But anyway, so this is a little visually confusing because to frame my thoughts for this course, what I did is I just wrote a big paper that turned out to be like a 15-page paper. And I'm dumping you into the middle of that. So this part, just ignore this stuff down here. Ignore that. Okay, we're just focusing on this right now. So the first thing that I want to say is that, well, I'll tell you what. Let's read the text and then we'll pick it apart. So, can I get somebody just to jump in and read this in the English? Whoever is feeling gutsy and literate.
Why does the Torah not use the word servitude or some other word, but rather sivlot, burden?
Okay, so pause there. So what he's talking about, excuse me, what he's talking about is when when God, in the book of Shemot, God decides that it's now time to move towards redemption, God gives a heads up to Moshe that God is going to move the Israelites from under the sivlot, from under the sivlot of the Egyptians. Okay, so God says to Moses, I'm going to free the Israelites from the sivlot of Egypt. So the question that we are going to be exploring now is why doesn't the Torah use a word like avodah or avodah kasha, slavery, or brutal slavery or brutal work? Why is it this particular word sivlot, which is usually translated as a burden? And so Simcha Bunim, who I'll explain who he is in just a moment, offers this answer. Okay, keep going.
Because initially enslavement
was
very difficult for them, but eventually they got used to it and it became natural. When the Holy Ones saw that they had become so accustomed to their slavery to Pharaoh and were ensnared in the material and brickwork that they no longer even felt it, God said, I will take them out from under the burdens of Egypt. If you are at the point that you can endure the burden of Egypt, it is not good, and I must free you.
It's kind of a clumsy translation there, but that's my clumsy translation. But you see the point. So so this word here that I've this word here is the word sivlot, burdens, and that's the quote from the Torah. So I don't want to spend too much time in this text because we're sort of circling around our main topic, but we're going to get to it. But essentially his point is that initially the problem was to use the language that we are using, that I've been using tonight. Initially, it sounds like Simcha Bunim is saying that the problem was that the Israelites did not perceive themselves to be in a crisis, right? They didn't see the world around them as being intolerable and empty of meaning, and they didn't look out into the world and say, oh my God, there must be something different, right? They became accustomed to the situation in Egypt, and that was actually what alarmed God, according to Simcha Bunim. And so, by the way, who is Simcha Bunim? Simcha Bunim is I think that 2 generations after the Baal Shem Tov. I could be wrong, but he's the main teacher of the Kotzker Rebbe, which I'm only mentioning here because those of you who have learned with me know that the Kotzker is somebody who I'm always drawn to. But so Simcha Bunim is in the line of the Kotzker and of Ger Hasidism, which comes down through him, eventually through the Chidushei Harim and the Sfat Emet, and this Hasidut that's very, very well known. But so Simcha Bunim's insight here to me is very powerful, because one way to say this is even worse than being in a crisis, right, where your world is beginning to fall apart, is to be in it and not realize that's what's happening, right? To look out into a world that is facing real problems and real difficulty and facing real darkness, and to not realize that that's happening, and to think that it's normal. Okay, so that ability of the Israelites to accustom themselves even to brutal servitude was the moment, and Natan has a hand up, I'll get in 1 second, was the moment that caused God to say, wow, we have to act. I have to act, because now we're in serious trouble, because now they think that there's nothing wrong and they could just go on like this. Natan.
I just wanted to point out, and forgive me if you mentioned this and I didn't notice it, but I think the way he's making the connection here is that the Hebrew words for sivlot, the burdens, right, and lisbol, which is to tolerate, right, are the same root. So essentially, right, like, it's very easy in our lives to think to ourselves, oh, that's not really a burden. That's something I can tolerate, because it's, right, actually saying It's the same thing.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I did not mention that. I did not mention that. And I'm glad you drew that out. So Natan is, well, I don't need to repeat it except just to underscore this point that it's precisely because of that grammatical connection, right? He's framing a burden is, yeah, a burden's a bummer, but it's something that I can carry. And so, yes, he's zeroing in on the word sivlot and very precisely, and saying the problem was that they perceived that it was not too much to bear, right? Okay, so so I'll leave that as one text, and I guess the reason that I want to say that is already in a sense, this text offers some hope for our topic, because it suggests that if you look out into the world and you say, "Oi, we're in a bad way. Things are falling apart. I feel like I'm losing hope." Already, you're one level up from where you might be, right? Already, you're at the point where you're beginning to discern either. Well, I guess I'll just say it like this: that you're manifesting a desire in yourself to see something more in the world than you're seeing. And that's actually a very, very important step already. And I don't want to, this, in some ways, this point is hard to grasp because it sort of seems so obvious. But this turns out to be very, very important. And this is why to add a little bit of a layer here, this is why the role of that Jews have, the role that Jews have so often inhabited, which is to be sort of standing on the outside of the culture and offering critiques of the culture, is such a deeply important and deeply Jewish role, right? Whether it's as a comedian or an academic or as a philosopher or an activist, the idea that you're standing on the outside and you're saying, this can't be right. You know, I got to poke holes in this. I got to challenge it. That is so profoundly important, because every time you look at the world and you say, this can't be the only way this can't be the only proper arrangement of society. Even if you don't come with an answer of the better way to do it, you're already opening the possibility for other answers to come in. Okay, so I find this text very, very hopeful. Because it identifies that the feeling of, oh no, I'm in crisis, is already a reason for hope. Okay? Let me just pause there and see, does that make sense? Or are there questions, or anybody want to challenge me? Or yes?
Well, one challenge is that if we would stay naive and oblivious, then there's the possibility that God will come and rescue us.
Oh, that's right. That's interesting.
If in Egypt we had already realized that there was a problem and we were unhappy, maybe God wouldn't have been so worried and come to get us.
Right. Right. I think that's great. That's very smart. And then, so in other words, we should just like, I know I'm playfully teasing out what I think what you're saying. I'm teasing you, but let's just keep going until God lets us know that we've passed the point where it's okay, right? Now, one interesting thing, and I want to try not to get lured into this very enticing topic, is in the theology of Simcha Bunim, you know, it may be that what he's saying is it was in the Israelites okay, if you look at it from God's perspective, so to speak, what you see is God saying, okay, now it's time to act. But if you looked at it from another angle, it would be from the Israelites' perspective, it's just that God, the way God manifested that is within the Israelites, that they finally said, we can't take this anymore, right? But in any event, that's a separate conversation about theology and what it means to have God in the world, whether God is external to us or whether God manifests as our own intuitions about what must be in the world. Okay. Other questions or comments before we jump down? Yes, Michael.
So it strikes me when you look at the time when Moshe goes and starts the "let my people go" routine shtick, and Pharaoh's initial thing was, "What's the matter for you? Forget about it." And but wasn't that what it said?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
So,
pretty much what he
but
says.
but the first thing that happens before the plagues, before anything starts to seem real, is that the Egyptians, who used to drop the straw off for the Jews to be making their bricks and stuff, says, okay, now we're not even going to give you that anymore. We're just getting annoyed. So now you have to go out and get that. And that's when they start complaining. That's when they say, why did you come here?
Right,
You know, like things were okay up until now.
right,
And now
Right.
all of a sudden we've got this going on. So it was like having to bring them to that level, to throw something more on it, to have them actually go, oh yeah, this really sucks.
right,
Because
Right.
they were looking at what was happening before that. It was like everything was okay till now.
right. Nice. I like that. That's exactly right. So the text that we're about to look at resonates with what you just said. So now I'm going to share a text with you from the Meha Shaloach. And the Meha Shaloach is also a spiritual descendant of Simcha Bunim, for those who are interested in this kind of thing. So the Kotzker, as I said, is a student of Simcha Bunim, and the Meha Shaloach was very close to the Kotzker, and then they had a break. But they're in the same kind of theological line. So this teaching that I'm about to share with you fits very well with the theology that we just looked at. It resonates. It's very similar, as you'll see, but it doesn't actually work chronologically speaking. As you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So on the literal level, it doesn't fit out, but doesn't work out, but philosophically it does. So the Meah Shaloach is now looking a little earlier in the story. He has a comment on the Torah, and he's looking earlier in the story where it says that the Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out. And so the reason that this doesn't square with Simcha Bunim's on sort of the textual level is because Simcha Bunim was saying that the Israelites had not cried out, and that was what precipitated God wanting to move things forward. And the Meah Shaloach is making a slightly different point, but theologically it fits very well together. So I'll give you just a minute to read this in the English, and then we'll pick it apart. That's what we're reading. Okay, so it looks like I didn't translate this last phrase here, but I stopped right here. But this actually fits in really well, Anne, I think, with your question, right? Because the
Yeah, that's exactly what you said.
Right. So the Meah Shaloach is suggesting that God's presence manifest in the Israelites' dissatisfaction, right? So what I want to say here, and I guess I'm a little bit getting up on my soapbox here, or this is a little bit polemical, and this is like grumpy Rabbi Rose here. So just indulge me, because what are you going to do? So part of the point that I'm trying to make here is that insisting that we look on difficulty and darkness in the world is a grand and beautiful tradition, as in the Jewish spiritual tradition. And there is a kind of vision that's presented of Judaism that I sometimes see in the world that really grates on me. I told you I was going to be a little grumpy. And that is this notion that, and I think that I see it in the traditional world, or the modern Orthodox world at least, and I see it, across the spectrum. And that is this notion that if we live a life of mitzvah and a life of Torah, then our lives will be happy and will be fulfilled, and everything will kind of fit together very nicely if we do the right thing as Jews, right? And once you say it out loud, you can already see that, of course, nobody would ever say that they really accept that idea. But I do see a kind of vision of Judaism sometimes articulated in which there's just a little bit too much satisfaction with the world. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And I think it's not honest to our textual tradition. So looking out into the world and saying, this does not feel like a good place. I know God made it, and I know God wants us to be happy and everything my tradition tells me, but this is scary and I ain't buying it. That is a good thing for us to be able to say. So these are just two among many, many, many texts that underscore that point. So there's a little bit of a hidden fourth reason for this class, which is sort of an angry fist shaking polemic at the Jews who are just too darn happy. Okay. So are there any questions or comments about the Mei HaShaloach? Because now we're going to start to really go into a little bit deeper level here. Okay. All right. Here we go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a text from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Okay, and so it takes off from the Psalms. So Rabbi Nachman is looking at the fourth Psalm, Psalm 4, verse 2, which is here. And I've translated, I don't know if this is my translation or somebody else's, I don't remember. But it says this, answer me, and sorry, ignore this. Sorry, I know this is very confusing. I'm sorry. Answer me when I call, O God, my vindicator. In my suffering, okay, but tsar, hirchavtali, I'm highlighting these for a reason. Chaneni ushma tefilati. Okay, so answer me when I call out God, my vindicator. Okay, that's this part. In my suffering, batsar, you relieved me. Yeah, this part's not my translation. And I'll come to the alternative translation in a moment, which is here. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. Okay, so what you have to understand to see the beauty of both of the psalm, but also of Rabbi Nachman's teaching, is that the word tsar, which is very reasonably translated as like straits or suffering, that's the first part, but tsar, in my suffering or in my straits, right? Suffering or sometimes straits. And the word here, chavta, which is translated here as you relieved me, the root of this is rachov, which means like broad, right? Broad or open. So it's the opposite of tsar. And it's very hard to translate this in a way that draws out that meaning of the word rachav. Just spontaneously, anybody have any wisdom on Natan, any thought of how one might translate that in a good way that would give it sense of its meaning in terms of being the opposite of tsar?
You widened my world, widened
right.
things out.
Right. It's hard.
You widen things up.
Right. You widen things up. Right. Which here in the context it makes sense. But if you said that to somebody like, "Wow, thank you for widening things up," they'd be like, "What are you talking about? I brought you a cup of coffee."
Or
but anyway,
opening up, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe opening it up. Yeah. That's nice. But in any event, you see that these words are opposites. So this can mean suffering, but it really means narrow, right? We talk about Mitzrayim. People, you've heard no doubt before that Mitzrayim, the root of Mitzrayim, sometimes people will say is tsar, which is a narrow place. And here chavta means it's the word for broad, and it's turned into a verb here. So you opened it up for me. I like that. Okay. So in any event, what it's saying is, God, answer when I call you. When I've suffered, you have relieved me, and I'm asking you to do that again. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. Okay, so Rabbi Nachman says this. And what he's going to focus on, what he's going to focus on is this preposition here. The word, the letter bet, ba, sar, which ba means can be, excuse me, the letter bet can mean in or through. So he's going to really play with this word in a way that we'll see. Okay, so will somebody read this for me? Michael Sasnow, you're hired.
Thank you. That is, even in, through the suffering itself, God provides us with relief. For if a person considers God's kindness, she will see that even while God causes her suffering, also within the suffering itself, God provides her with relief and increases kindness towards her. This is the meaning of "in my suffering you relieve me." That is, even in the midst of the suffering itself, you provided me with relief from within it. Not only do we look to God to speedily save us from all suffering and provide us with great good, but also, even within the suffering itself, we look to God to provide us with relief.
So let me ask you here, what is he talking about? Who wants to take a crack at explaining what Rabbi Nachman means here? And this is not like, I'm not playing hide the ball here. I'm just, let's explore this text. What is he trying to say about suffering? How is it that within suffering, God shows us kindness? What are possibilities?
There's an opportunity in these times of suffering to experience some relief and some joy that may not be available to us in just a mundane, average time of our lives.
Right. I like that. Beautifully said. That somehow there's something about these situations and these conditions that may open positive experiences that we would not have seen without this, or we would not have experienced without this. Now, I would be careful to say, no one should ever say in a glib way that fact makes all suffering okay, right? There's no problem. And I think that what's really important about this kind of theology that says that there is light to be found in darkness, what's really critical about this, in my opinion, is that is something that a person can say to themselves about their own suffering. But we don't say to another person who's in the midst of suffering, oh, I'm sure there's good in it, you just haven't found it, right? And that may sound silly, but we've all probably heard people say that, in part because people are anxious when they're comforting somebody else and they don't want them to feel sad, and so they'll say whatever they have to say, or it may be that they have experienced in their own life, but I don't think it works to just sort of prescribe that for somebody else. But in any event, Rabbi Nachman was a person who suffered because he was a human, and he had a lot of darkness and difficulty in his life. So he's writing this from his own experience, and he's certainly prescribing it for us, but he's Rabbi Nachman, so we'll give him a pass. He's also drawing on, I think he's drawing on a long rabbinic tradition that is, evident in early rabbinic writings and in the Gemara, that one of the ways that God shows love for us is by causing us to suffer, by punishments of love, which is a concept that the rabbis have. So I'll just say that I'm not totally comfortable with that, but I think he's drawing in part on that. But I think he's saying something ultimately more powerful than that, which is, I can't add tremendously to what Daniel already said. It's possible also, Daniel, and I think what you offered stands at a higher level of what I'm about to say. He might simply just mean that even when things are difficult, it's pretty rare that there's a situation, something that don't exist, pretty rare there's a situation where the suffering is so intense that there's zero joy, zero kindness, zero hope within it, right? Almost every situation and difficulty we find ourselves in, there's also moments of love and laughter I spend a lot of time with families around funerals and around deaths and even tragic deaths. Certainly, nobody would ever have chosen these to happen, but I've sat with families who are finding joy and comfort in the memory, and they're still happy, and life still goes on. So it might just be that he's addressing that as well. Okay, so now we're going to go here. So this is where things are going to start to get weird. Okay. Because we're going to go deep into some very heavy texts. Okay, so this is a passage from the Gemara. I'd have to look at my own footnote to remember precisely where, but I'm sharing this text with you because the text we're going to look at after it is going to use this text as its foundation. Okay, so let's see, I need another reader. I'll guide you through the Hebrew words that are difficult.
I'll take it on. Rav Chisda said to one of the sages who was arranging Agadic teachings before him, "Did you hear what led David to say the 15 ma'alot?"
Okay, pause there. Pause there. So let me just explain this. The teacher, the Rav Chisda said to one of the sages who was arranging Agadic teachings. He was, I don't know, I think he was just preparing to share, or he was sharing certain teachings. We don't have to go into what the Agadah was at this point. He was just sharing teachings with Rav Chisda. And the 15 Ma'alot, what this is a reference to is that there are 15 Psalms that are called Shir Lamalot, Shir Lama'alot. And you've probably encountered this in reading the Psalms before. You may not have just noticed that line, but sometimes it's translated as a song of ascents. Sometimes it's not translated because people don't really know what to do with it. But there are just 15 Psalms that at the beginning have this phrase, song of ascent, a song of ascent. Okay, so Rav Chisda is saying, I'm going to teach you why David, because most of the Psalms are attributed to King David. I'm going to teach you now why King David used this phrase, ascents, in these certain Psalms. Okay, keep going.
He answered, "This is what Rabbi Yochanan said. When David dug the drain pipes in the foundation of the temple, the depths, Tahom, rose up seeking to inundate the world. David recited these 15 ascents and caused them to subside." Rav Chisda said, "Then why 15 ascents? It should be the descents." The sage said, "Since you're reminding me, thus it was said, when David dug the drain pipes, the depths rose and sought to inundate the world. David said, 'Is there anyone who knows whether it is permitted to write the sacred name on an earthenware shard? We will write it and throw it into the depths, and they will subside.'"
Okay, so as I like to say sometimes in my Kabbalah class, if you're not confused, you were not paying attention. So this is a very strange teaching, and we're going to reflect on it a little bit, and then we're going to go into another teaching that's going to really just run away with this idea. Okay, so a couple things. One is, why do the Psalms use this phrase, a song of ascents, as an introduction for these 15 Psalms that say that? And it turns out that according to this tradition they have, when King David was digging the drain pipes that would serve as ultimately for the foundation of the temple, this thing happened. So before we talk about the thing, so the drain pipes, I wouldn't, at least on the Pshat level, the drain pipes are just what they sound like. They're just drain pipes. I'm not an engineer, but I guess a building needs drain pipes. So, and when they did that, as soon as they dug into the ground to give water a place to drain into, the water from the depths, the Tahom, rose up, and they were seeking to inundate the world. And maybe it would be more powerful if I had just said to drown the world, right? Because you're supposed to perceive this as a threat. Okay, so it's such a powerful symbol, and we're not going to be able to unpack all of the possibilities of this story. But we're creating this place that will allow the Jewish people and ultimately all of the nations to come and to develop a relationship with God. And at the foundation of that process of creating that and engineering it so it would be able to function, these subterranean depths come up and they threaten to drown everything, like as though it would be another flood, yet another undoing of God's creation. And what's so powerful about this symbol is that it suggests that there's this like teeming chaos under the world. And teeming chaos underneath the surface of the world, like this potent force of destruction that could undo everything, that like is desiring to come up and to tear creation apart. And you may think that, like, in saying that, in understanding that to be a threat against the nature of creation itself, that I'm overstating the case. But for sure, this story has in mind the flood story, right? So the idea of waters coming to like inundate the world, for sure, has a link to that flood story. And of course, the flood story was essentially a undoing of creation so that God could then recreate. What I think is powerful about this is that it's important to me, it's important that this story was not like, King David was out like building a recording studio, so he could like play his awesome harp music. And it was then that that the depths rose up, that it was specifically in the process of creating a place to worship God, a place where people would find meaning and purpose and order and all of the good blessings of the world. It was in the process of laying the foundations for that this crisis emerged, right? And so I'm reading the Tehom here as being more than just water. The Tehom, the depths here, are these forces of like these primeval forces primordial forces of chaos that want to tear apart the ordered world. And in that sense, we still deal with the Tehomot. We still deal with the depths. Okay, is everybody with me? If I'm talking nonsense or it doesn't make sense, you gotta just tell me. Okay, all right. So, so then the second part we're not going to spend too much time on, but it's so incredibly powerful. So there's this strange bit where where the sage says, hey, you've reminded me, and then he shares a very, very similar teaching, but it has this added riff, which in the interest of time, I'm going to hold myself back from exploring, but it's very, very powerful, and it'll come up in the following teaching, and then we can explore it a little bit more. Okay, so here's the story from the Talmud, and now we're going to look at another text. Give me one moment. Why am I not getting the option for full screen here in my? Okay, give me one moment. Let me just orient myself. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to ask Natan to tell me how to pronounce this word.
In Polish, or the way we usually say it in English?
Say it in Polish.
Radziner. Radziner.
It's so beautiful. Okay, and how do we usually say it in English?
Radziner.
Right, exactly. But I like you say it much better.
Although
okay,
actually, in Yiddish, it might have been said Radziner as well, so that should be fine.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know that. I assumed that I'm always so self-conscious about pronouncing some of these names because I know that I'm doing it wrong, but it sounds like in this case it might have been okay. Okay, so the Radziner Rebbe says this. he says that my teacher explained that the matter of the depths, okay, so he's referring to the story we just read. Here's the word in Hebrew, tahom. The matter of the tahom is that Hashem hid exceedingly precious light, and we'll come back and talk about what that means, in the most distant places. Hashem covered it, that is, covered that light with a thick surface and concealed it, so it was nearly impossible to recognize the will guiding the world. This concealment and hiddenness is the tahom, concerning which David HaMelech composed 15 ascents. Okay, so let's pick this apart a little bit. So now we're very deep into Kabbalah now. Okay, we're really very deep into Kabbalistic Jewish mystical territory, because we're talking about tahom not as they were in the Peshat and the sort of basic meaning of the Talmudic text, where it meant like these waters that are under the surface of the ground. But now we're really talking about cosmic forces. Okay, so but let's get there in this way. Hashem hid exceedingly precious light. Okay, first of all, those who have studied text a little bit on their own or studied with me, what is precious? What does it mean? What is light in this sense? If we're not talking about actual like light bulb light or candle light, what does this mean? Any sense? Anybody want to take a guess?
Knowledge.
Okay, could be knowledge, but it's even a more purely divine force than that. It's simple and not simple. What it simply means, God's goodness. God's goodness is in the world. Now that goodness it might just be blessing that we encounter in our lives, but more likely, he's drawing on the Kabbalistic tradition that when we talk about God's light, what we're talking about is not just blessing and goodness that God's bringing into the world, but God's like fundamental plan for the world. That is God's plan for the world, that it should ultimately become a place of harmony and peace and goodness and togetherness. Like that is God's ultimate plan according to the Kabbalah. That is referred to as light. So again, it's not physical light. We're not talking about when you light a dimly lit room and the light radiates. That is being used as an analogy, that sometimes we look in the world and we just see darkness, but actually we see spiritual darkness, but actually there is divine light. That is God's overarching plan for goodness in the world, but it becomes very hard to see. So when it says in the most distant places, what he means is even the places that you don't associate with God, right? So what we might associate with God are, first of all, prayer, tefillah, and acts of kindness between people, when somebody reaches out to help another person. Like these are places where we are comfortable saying God's light is there. Right? Moments of harmony and joy and a sunset that's gorgeous and makes you think about the ordering of the world and all of that stuff. But in distant places, that is places that seem distant from God, there's even light there. So in moments of difficulty, in moments of anxiety, in moments of despair, even when we see cruelty, even when we ask ourselves, is God in this place? Even there is divine light. There is within that still the reality of God's overarching plan for goodness in the world, but it's just that it's concealed. So it's nearly impossible to recognize the will guiding the world. When it says the will, and I should have capitalized the, when it says the will, it's referring to God's will. So he's right here with us. He lives at a different time, but he lives in the same world that we live in. Sometimes it is nearly impossible to recognize, or we might say to believe, that there is any order to the world. And when the Talmud uses the metaphor of the, excuse me, when it uses the language of the depths, that's what it means. It's talking about that experience of being nearly overwhelmed by the difficulty and pain and suffering of the world. And then what made King David was that he was able to confront that darkness and to insist, and he was able to cause the depths to descend through his spiritual life, through his prayer, through his writing of Psalms, through his teaching, you know, all of these things that the rabbis sort of imagined onto him. In doing that, he caused the depths to subside, right? King David caused the despair, the anxiety, the doubt, the kind of existential horror. He caused that to go down because, and that's, you know, that's what made King David a great teacher, a great rabbi, a great rebbe in the rabbinic, in the rabbinic imagination. So let me pause there, just see comments, questions.
I hesitate to say it because in the vein of not projecting, oh, it's all for the best onto other people's experience, but it reminds me of how can you look at something like George Floyd's killing, and yet if you look at all of the activism and political change and
Right.
movement toward justice that has come about because of that horrible moment, that even in that place that you would think there's nothing good about this, it has led to some, you know, good and change and justice in the world.
Right. No, I think that's a very potent and very spot on reconnection of this idea to our current situation. Absolutely. That's right. I mean, who would have thought that, like, well, let me put it this way. Somebody's got noise going on in the background. What would it take to get Americans to explore the history of race in this country? What would it take to get millions of Americans to buy books that explore this question? Whether people are on the political left or political right and have this answer or that answer to whatever the next step is, what would it take to be able to educate themselves and take seriously the history of this country? Well, nobody would ever say that it would be worth paying a human life to make that happen, right? That's not what this is about. But it sort of, and this connects with Daniel's comment earlier. Suffering sometimes opens possibilities that one never imagined, right? And again, it doesn't mean that you would choose it or that it's worth it or or like it's not a cost benefit analysis. I don't think that paradigm is useful. It's just recognizing the reality that suffering sometimes opens up possibilities. Okay, so now we're going to go a little bit deeper into this idea of this Kabbalistic idea about the darkness and light, because we're going to get to a very, very important point here that I think is really essential for us to understand. Okay, so this is a passage from Sefer Eitz Chaim. Sefer Eitz Chaim is a book that some of you have heard of Arizal, also known as Yitzhak Luria, who's a kind of centrally important teacher of Kabbalah from the 16th century. And Sefer Eitz Chaim is not his writing, but it is the writings of his students, and probably first and foremost of Chaim Vital, who was one of his students who disseminated his writings. Anyway, a lot of the core teachings of what many people think of as Kabbalah are laid down in Sefer Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim just means the tree of life. And I'll give you a moment to read this, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so that's the Kabbalistic view of what the world was like before creation was brought into, before there was creation. It was just God. We can't really say anything about it because it's totally beyond our comprehension. It was just undifferentiated oneness. And in the Kabbalistic language, it was just pure light. Okay, again, not literal light, but it was that. So, but then what happens is, according to the Kabbalistic reading of the universe, and I'm saying things now that many of you have heard many times and studied with me and elsewhere, then what happens is, in order to make space for creation, what happens is that God does this thing called tzimtzum. God constricts God's self, so to speak, in order to make space for the created world. Okay, and so the Kabbalists, all we have is language, and all we can do is use images, and it's very hard to not take the images literally, but it's very difficult not to take them literally, but it's very important that we do not take them literally. But so initially there's just this undifferentiated singularity or oneness, unity, within which there couldn't be any differentiation, there couldn't be any creation, there couldn't be time, space, you, me, there's just oneness. In order to create the world, God had to change that and create space where there was not divinity. And in doing that, God created what is called a halal pinui, which is essentially means like an empty void. God had to create the void in order for there to be creation. And as many people have pointed out, this is such a powerful way to talk about the creation of the world, because it immediately allows you to see, it gives an explanation for why there's suffering in the world. But also, I think there's another very important point, which is that there is a one-to-one relationship between God's concealment and the possibility of revelation. Okay, what I mean by that is that when the world was filled with divine light, we could not perceive that divine light because we didn't exist. And until God concealed the divine light, and in concealing the divine light, allowed evil to exist, allowed something that was opposed to godliness. Until that happened, we couldn't exist. And the Kabbalists talk about the fact that divine light can be so overwhelming that it's beyond our comprehension. We literally can't perceive it if it's too intense, because it begins to sort of annihilate us in some sense. So the more concealed it is, the more revealed it can be, right? So the possibility of revelation depends on God's concealment of God's self. Does that make sense? Like, whether or not you agree with it, you at least understand what I'm saying, right? So that's why I said there's a one-to-one relationship, and I haven't really run the numbers. I don't know if it's literally one-to-one, but there's a relationship between God's diminishment of God's self and the possibility that we can grow in understanding and come closer to God through comprehension. So it's, in other words, to put this in slightly different language, the crisis and the apparent absence of God is something that allows us to, according to the Kabbalah, to begin to perceive God. And it sounds, well, I guess it is paradoxical. It is paradoxical. And Paul.
Well, it brings us right back to the very first point of the Hebrew slaves not being aware that they were suffering. And so
right.
the awareness of the suffering was the beginning of the journey to being saved.
That's right. That's right. That's beautiful. I hadn't really thought about how nicely that connects. What I want to do is I'm going to steer us to another one closing teaching. Oh, sorry, Natan, go ahead.
Can you explain that one-to-one correlation again, please?
Yes, and when I said I know that everybody knew I was joking when I said one-to-one and then made a joke about running the numbers, but I actually should be careful about that because it is misleading. But what I mean is, so the Kabbalists say that that let me say it like this. There's sort of a perfect balance where there's enough divine light in the world, enough blessing and order and harmony and hope in the world that we can perceive it when we're kind of at our best. The balance between that and there being a world where there is no divine light, which would just be total chaos and destruction on the one hand, and on the other hand, being so much divine, there being so much divine light that we are overwhelmed, right? So for the Kabbalists, there is this sense that it's actually possible to have so much divinity that it's actually destructive, right? It annihilates us. And so the world that we live in, the world that, like, you know, in the Kabbalist framing of the story, God created this world just so there would be little enough light that we could exist and have free will and move about and perceive and appreciate beauty and get to know ourselves and get to know other people. But there would be enough divine light that there's the possibility for us to discern and order. And then here's the important part, contribute to that order. Like, we can participate in healing the world because we can perceive that divine light. Right? So what does that look like when I say we can perceive that divine light? Because I realize I throw around these, I mean, all of us throw around these Kabbalistic metaphors without really trying to think what they mean practically. We can either, and think back to the Israelites in Egypt, either through our intuition that says, I can't take this anymore, right? The world is so beep that I'm just fed up and this can't be right, that it motivates us to act, right? You know, I want to be part of the change. I want to help. I can't stand this anymore. I want to get this guy or that guy out of office, and I want to insist that our city finally help with homelessness, and I'm going to contribute to it in this way and help build mini homes and da-da-da-da-da. Either through that or just through being inspired, right? Moments of inspiration in our lives that can happen randomly, they can happen during prayer, they can happen when we see something beautiful, whatever it might be. That's what I mean by perceiving the divine light. And then the critical component and the deeply Jewish component is that we then recognize that we have a role in that. Somebody up in the upper right of my screen, and you don't know who you are, looked like they were about to speak. Anybody about to say something? Okay. So let me now share with you one other teaching. So now we're actually coming down way back down from the peaks of the Kabbalah, down into much more familiar Midrashic territory that I want to use as a kind of way to try to bring together some of the threads. So what are those threads? Just very quickly, the threads are that things really are bad. Okay, that it is not the job of the religious person to look out into the world and say, oh, things are actually really wonderful. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't look like it, but God made a beautiful world and we just have to appreciate it, right? That to me is a total like religious nihilism, if there can be such a thing, and total abdication of serious reflection on the nature of the world. It is okay and true to say that the world is deeply broken and intolerably so, okay? That's one thread. And then the other thread is to say at the same time, somewhere within that chaos, somewhere within that darkness and difficulty and suffering, there is a healing in there somewhere, that I'm going to insist that there's hope in there somewhere. Now, what's interesting about this, and I did not include a Rebbe Nachman text that talks about this, that I don't think that I can ever prove to you, or that you could prove to yourself logically, that there's just enough hope in the world to overrule the chaos, right? So Rebbe Nachman talks about an emunah pshuta, I think is how he phrases it, just like a simple faith, which on the one hand sounds very disappointing because it's such a like stock answer. We just have to have simple faith. But on the other hand, it is very, very profound, I think, because what alternative do we have, right? Can we write, like, can we really make a philosophical or rational argument that life should outweigh, that hope outweighs despair? Can we put down on some kind of like ledger and demonstrate numerically? Like at some point, it is going to require us to say, rationality is not going to serve me in these moments of crisis. At some level, as a person, I have to just say, I have this narrative that comes to me about darkness and light, or chaos and order, and I'm going to live as a person who is open to finding light within that darkness. And so if we had more time, we would go through this Rebbe Nachman teaching that really meditates beautifully on this idea. But I do think that there is something very profound about this idea of emunah, of faith. Not the faith that like, oh, God will fix everything, it'll be fine. But a faith that there is reason for hope in the world, and therefore reason for me to act towards the fulfillment of goodness in the world. Okay, so now let's turn to this very well-known, well, by some people, very well-known midrash. You know what? Should have done this to begin with. We're in full screen mode, ladies and gentlemen. I hope your life just got a lot better. So, okie dokie. So this is a gorgeous midrash that blew my mind the first time I heard it, and then I just love it more and more and more. So, will somebody who has not yet read this in English? This is a midrash that starts by looking at Psalm 45:11 and then quickly moves into this Abraham story. Will somebody read this?
Mm-hmm. This is what's in blue?
Yep.
Psalm 45:11. Listen, young lady, incline your ear, forget your people and your father's house. Rabbi Isaac said, this can be compared to a person who was going from place to place and saw a building radiating light. He said, can it be that no one is in charge of this building? The owner looked down at him and said, I am the owner of the building. Just so, because Abraham said, is this the world without someone in charge? The Holy One looked down at him and said, I am the owner of the world. And let the king be aroused by your beauty, since he is your Lord. Bow to him. The words by your beauty means your beauty in the world. He bowed to him, and then God spoke to Abraham.
Okay, so we're not going to be able to unpack all of this midrash, but for right now, just to avoid confusion, I'm just going to block that out because I want to just focus on this. So Rabbi Isaac sees this passage in the Psalms, and he says, this is how to think about the Abraham story. A person's going from place to place, and they saw a building radiating light. Okay, so the operative phrase here, if I can find it, the word is doleket, and you'll recognize this verb from lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, right? Lahadlik is to light. So doleket here means radiating. We'll come back to another possibility, which you may have even heard me talk about. But for right now, he saw a building radiating light. And Abraham said, what? There's this gorgeous building? Like he's walking through the middle of nowhere, and there's this gorgeous palace with light bursting out of it. And he says, like, who owns this? It can't be that nobody owns this place. And just then the owner looks down, I guess maybe from the balcony or whatever, or from above, and says, I am the owner of the building. So in the same way, that's the way that we can understand what Abraham did. Abraham was walking through the world, and he saw the world radiating with light. And who knows how we're supposed to understand that, whether it's he discerns that there's a divine order in it, or he just sees that it's so gorgeous and harmonious, and the natural world is just stunning, and the miracle of life. And he says, it can't be that there's nobody in charge. It just can't be. This place is too perfect. And at that moment, God looks down and says, I am the owner of the world. And owner is I don't know why I translated it as owner. I guess because I didn't like the valence of Baal, which is the word that is in Hebrew, which is sometimes translated as master. But owner is just sounds weird. In any event, as soon as Abraham asks that question, can it be that there's nobody in charge? Boom, God answers. Now, what did this actually look like from Abraham's perspective? I think what the rabbis are saying is Abraham is in some kind of meditation, or he has this realization that just, it can't be that the world is without a place this beautiful must have someone or some being that has created a larger order within it, right? That's what's happening in Abraham's experience, I think. What is really powerful, and at first I thought that when I first heard this teaching, and because you may have heard it as well, I thought that it was just the teaching of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who introduces what I'm about to share. But it actually is a much earlier, centuries earlier teacher who raises this possibility, and that is that Doleket might not, radiating light might not be the proper translation, but burning building might be the better translation. So a very different valence. So in that reading, what Abraham sees as he looks around the world is not a place of harmony and beauty, but a place of total destruction, like a world that is like eating itself and is just, everything is going horribly wrong. And he says to himself, are we just floating around through space and people treating, you got to mute. I don't know who you are. I love you, but you got to mute. And he looks around the world and he says, things are so horrible. I see so much cruelty and brutality and on and on and on. Are we just left here on our own? Like no one is going to stand up and take charge here? And in that moment, God says, Ani hu ba'al ha'olam. I am the master, or I am the owner of the world. So, this is just yet another example of the unbelievable potency and richness of the Hebrew language, that the word doleket can have this ambivalence where either it means that Abraham marvels at the perfect harmony, or he is having a crisis because of the horror that he sees around him. So you already know where I'm going with this, which is that neither this translation nor that translation is correct, but that the word doleket, I think, has to contain both of these possibilities. That as we look out into our world, we are totally justified in having a sense of despair and anxiety and horror and even anger at God for creating the world in this way, or creating the world and then apparently abandoning us. And at the same time saying, this place is a place full of hope and possibility and goodness and beauty. Those two possibilities must exist side by side. And I would say, if we let go of either one of those, either because in moments of despair, we're so cynical that we're not willing to, say, we don't want to risk sounding so naive as to say the world is beautiful and lovely, or because we're so filled with tranquility and joy in this particular moment that we don't want to look at the darkness, that the world is incomplete, or our religious worldview is incomplete if we don't have both of these. And so let me pause there, and then we're going to close by just sharing with you one little hidden nugget in this midrash. Natan.
I noticed that your edition of the midrash has Anihu Baal Ha'olam as the acronym that spells out Ahava, love. Do you agree with that?
What do you mean? Do I agree with it?
Well, I mean, it may not have been intentional in the original telling
Right.
of the midrash, but
yeah,
maybe it's coincidental, maybe not.
Right. Well, put it this way. I'm the one who put those in bold letters. So, so yeah, I'll tell you something. And if some of you have already heard me talk about this, and this was the hidden nugget that I was just, and I guess by putting these in bold letters, I didn't make it very hidden. So I was reading this story. This is like one of my favorite Jewish moments of my favorite moments of studying Jewish texts. I was reading the Kotzker Rebbe once, and it said that the Kotzker, there's this teaching about the Kotzker Rebbe that said the Kotzker was reading this midrash, and he just stood there completely dumbfounded. And that was that's the whole story. He's reading it, and he's just like, can't believe what he reads. And it doesn't say anything about it. It doesn't say anything. And I was like, what the heck kind of teaching is that? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so it inspired me to go back over the midrash. And I went to the midrash, and as though I had never read it before, this acronym leapt out at me. And I just thought, yeah, so my answer, Natan, is that it is not a coincidence. There's no way it is a coincidence. So for those, sorry, I should have backed up. For those who don't know, so ani means I, who, hard to translate in this context, means am the one. Ba'al ha'olam, I am the owner or the master of the world.
Will you share this screen while you do that?
Oh, sorry. I thought I was sharing the screen, sorry. Ani hu ba'al ha'olam. This is the phrase we're talking about, and as you can see, I've put the first letter of each word in bold. This is God saying, I am the owner or the master of the world. And the first letter of each of those words is Aleph, He, Bet, He, and that spells Ahava. So it's just, which means love. So I'm not willing to entertain the possibility that this is a coincidence. Like we know enough about our, our gorgeous midrashim to know that they were written by, literary and theological geniuses. I just won't believe. It can't be that this is an accident. So then, theologically, what does this mean? As the underlying order to the world, and I think this works whether deleket means radiant or whether it means burning, the underlying order of the world that Abraham perceives is love. That he has this sense, and again, I think this goes beyond rationality. He has this experience of love. Either that means that he feels God's love, or maybe it could also mean, and I don't want to say these two options exhaust the possibilities of what this means, or he has a sense of his love for God or for the world and for other people, and that motivates him to act as a source of healing in the world, but that somehow this experience reveals to him that love is the underlying order of the universe. And I know that in saying that, I'm sort of introducing a new note that's not something we talked about yet, and that would bear much more exploration than we can really do. It really feels like that's another class. But that would be Abraham's experience, according to this midrash, of seeing the possibility within the darkness. And I wanted to share that with you and hope that regardless of what you may believe is theologically true, I hope that all of us can act with this sense that even in times of great difficulty and crisis, if we can act with the idea that ahava and love is at the core of all things and of our actions, then we won't go wrong. Closing comments, thoughts, reflections? Thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you here as we explored this in the time of the year.
I just wanted to say that was a great teaching, Yasher Koach, and you took that arc was pretty amazing.
Thank you. Thanks. All right, everybody. Wonderful to learn with you, and we'll talk soon. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Good. I was just gonna call you.